Joe Flacco rode the Audubon Green wave to a record-setting senior year just a year and a half after Trent Dilfer and the Baltimore Ravens won Super Bowl 35. Another year passed, and he found himself a member of the Pitt Panthers ahead of the 2003 season. The Panthers actually started out that season on an NFL field, hosting the Kent State Golden Flashes for a Week 1 thrashing at the Steelers' Heinz Field on Saturday, September 6th. But if we again turn to Sundays for a moment, that rate of change within the game that we all alluded to was accelerating in the NFL, with the guys under center, at the center of it all. Super Bowl 35 had featured performances by both the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, but the most recent Super Bowl had instead featured a new kid on the block, Tom Brady. Following a devastating set of injuries suffered by their franchise quarterback, Drew Bledsoe, the New England Patriots instead turned to the second-year backup Brady, who stepped in and held down the fort admirably. He eventually pushed out Bledsoe after managing to play just good enough and throwing just enough completions on that final drive for the defense and kicker Adam Vinatieri to win the franchise's first ever championship in Super Bowl 36.
But even now, Brady was seen as a good but perhaps not great passer. Writers like the Boston Globe's Will McDonough still said to Brady indirectly that no one should get too comfortable in this business. There was no amount of talent or winning that could make you immune to criticism if just a couple of postseason games went wrong. And there was no one better illustrating that than the quarterback on the other side of the budding rivalry, Indianapolis' Peyton Manning. Drafted in 1998, Manning had immediately signaled a change in the fortune of the Indianapolis professional football team, if not immediately in their win-loss record as they stumbled through a 3-13 season. Soon enough, though, they started to see the payoff. By the end of the 2002 season, they'd sported a 39-25 record with 3 playoff appearances in the same span. The problem was that while Manning outshone Brady in the regular season, all 3 of those playoff appearances were one-and-done trips. Eventually, the two would reach more of a balance in their respective regular season and playoff accolades, but in this snapshot of history, they offered the 2 poles of a spectrum for what success for a modern quarterback can look like in this era.
Now, it's not like the only quarterbacks here in the 2000s are these 2 guys. There's a young Drew Brees who's about to have a career-altering change of scenery when he moves from San Diego to New Orleans, and that's going to set up a successor in San Diego, Phillip Rivers, who'll use that as a launching pad for an underrated run with the Chargers. There's still the gunslinger up north, Brett Favre, who's going to putter along, occasionally retiring and unretiring several times before he eventually gives way to his successor, another MVP in Aaron Rodgers. And then Pittsburgh's renaissance is going to owe a debt to the polarizing but undeniable play of Ben Roethlisberger. But even with this embarrassment of riches in the league, Brady and Manning were the yardsticks against whom all others were measured. And it's fair to say that Joe, as the Panthers took Heinz Field in the fall of 2003, was imagining how he might stack up against those guys if he could ever just get a chance to play in the league on Sundays. Problem is, before he can even think about playing on Sundays, he's going to have to earn a chance to play on Saturdays at Pitt. Joe had arrived at Pitt during an exciting time for the program, which had been in need of a jolt for a while. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, the Panthers had been one of the dominant college forces. They posted 3 straight 11-1 seasons from 1979 to 1981, and star quarterback and local legend Dan Marino capped his time there in 1982 with a gorgeous performance in that year's Sugar Bowl against the Georgia Bulldogs, led by future failed senatorial candidate Herschel Walker. However, since then, the program had oscillated between middling and miserable. Prior to 1997, they had won a combined 12 games over their previous 4 seasons, and the school sensed it was time to make a change. Enter Walt Harris, just coming off of stints as the QB coach for both the New York Jets and the Ohio State University. The offensive guru immediately turned things around, winning Big East Coach of the Year honors as the 6-6 Panthers made the Liberty Bowl, their first bowl game of any kind since 1989. Over the next few years, he continued to develop the program, as well as stars like standout wide receivers and Biletnikoff winners in Antonio Bryant and Larry Fitzgerald, the latter of which even got to appear as the cover athlete for NCAA Football 2005. The program's profile and Harris's profile were on the rise, and Flacco, redshirting during that 2003 star-making season for Fitzgerald, must have been thrilled at the thought of playing under the signal-calling specialist with such talented pass catchers ready to haul in his deep bombs. But unfortunately, as it often is, that's not exactly how things were going to go.
Come 2004, Fitzgerald had declared for the draft, and the skill positions were notably depleted. Still, Flacco had made do with less, and there was a terrific defense in place led by D-back Darrelle Revis. Problem is, Joe wasn't given the chance to do anything with this roster. Instead, Harris turned to redshirt sophomore Tyler Palko, who, much like Dan Marino, had been a regional high school hero at nearby West Allegheny, lettering 4 times as the coach's son in football, before his senior year getting selected to the U.S. Army All-American Bowl in 2002. His true freshman year, he took a handful of snaps, including an 8-yard touchdown rush in the 2002 Insight Bowl against the Oregon State Beavers, but following this, like Joe, he redshirted for the following 2003 season. When Harris elected to go with Palko to start the season, Tyler admittedly did not disappoint. In 12 games that year, he threw for 3,067 yards with 24 touchdowns to only 7 interceptions, with a huge high-profile win over Notre Dame, where he became the first ever visiting player in South Bend history to throw for 5 touchdowns against the Fighting Irish. Meanwhile, as the backup, Flacco completed 1 of his 4 pass attempts all season for a total of 11 yards, while also gaining 0 on the ground in 6 attempts. And a single 25-yard punt. What I would give to see video of that Joe Flacco punt. The team MVP and an offensive captain in his first year as a starter, Palko looked to have the Panthers rolling as they went into bowl season. But as the team prepared to face the Utah Utes in the Fiesta Bowl, the first BCS bowl in school history, rumors began to trickle out. One of the many uncomfortable truths about college football is that any coach that's concerned with raising the profile of their school is also likely as much, if not more, concerned with raising their own profile. Whispers could now be heard in NCAA corners that Walt Harris was set to leave the Panthers following this year so he could take charge of the Stanford Cardinal out west. The rumors were true, and it's a good thing he secured that contract before this game because, wow, does Utah absolutely demolish the Panthers in this game, sacking poor Tyler Palko a season-high 9 times in the 35-7 loss to close out the Walt Harris era at Pitt.
The school, afraid of returning to the land of mediocrity from which they'd finally emerged, looked far and wide for Harris's replacement. Except they did not at all. They followed seemingly the number one criteria for any major position within the Panthers, which is to be a local from the Pittsburgh area. And as a former NFL head coach for the Bears and Dolphins, which included a little bit of overlap with fellow alumnus Dan Marino, and the bonus points of having already been a player and graduate assistant for Pitt, Dave Wanstead was the ideal candidate and got the job with ease. If Flacco was hoping that things would look different now under new management, or that perhaps that 9-sack performance against Utah had taken some of the shine off of Palko's previous performance, he would find himself sorely mistaken. Wanstead still felt, as surely as Harris had, that guys like Palko and Steel Valley product Luke Getsy were from programs that were maybe a little more sophisticated than what Joe had in high school. And so following the spring practices, the new coaching staff made it clear that they intended to ride with Palko yet again as the starter for the team.
They had talked for a long time about what they saw in Flacco, but talk was cheap, and with still only 1 pass to his name, the impatience was growing. With those publicly stated intentions to start Palko, Joe went and publicly stated his own intention to transfer, much to the school and Wanstad's dismay. Flacco claims there are no hard feelings now, and even remains in contact with Harris to this day, but you have to imagine there were some hard feelings then. That's because Wanstad and offensive coordinator Matt Cavanaugh, after meeting with Joe and Father Stephen and failing to change the young quarterback's mind, refused to sign off on the transfer. Now, while this is prior to the changes in the transfer system in recent years that would allow players to immediately suit up for new teams, this was still commonplace to allow a player to immediately play if they were to willingly go down a division, such as to a school like the University of Delaware. However, without Coach Wanstad's approval, Joe would have to sit for a year on the shelf without that sign-off. Not only did he have to sit out this entire season, Joe Flacco also had to continue to pay tuition for the full school year, during which he was unable to add to his running tally of a single completed pass in college. But patience is a virtue. And after patiently sitting out this season, Joe was ready to follow in his father's footsteps yet again, in a manner of speaking. After all, back during Stephen Flacco's college career, his biggest moment hadn't come to pass until the unfortunate demotion down from the 1A or FBS ranks to the 1AA or FCS ranks. Well, this wasn't a school making the jump down. Joe was all set to do just that now with an offer to journey back east. If he won't get a shot with the big boys, then his only chance is to try and fly on a wing tee and a prayer. It's time for Joe Flacco to join Delaware Blue Hens.
So before we get to Delaware, we've talked a couple times about the divide between 1A and 1AA. It feels worth it to go a little more in depth as to what the differences between those two actually look like. As early as the 1950s, the NCAA was beginning to realize that the amount of money certain programs were able to invest was creating an unlevel playing field in their ostensibly amateur athletic arenas. The first attempt to combat this came on the basketball side of things, when in 1956 it was decided that the college basketball tournament the following year would be split into two pools largely grouped by the size or financial resources of the institutions. They would have the university division for larger schools and the college division for smaller schools. After initially starting in basketball, this concept would migrate to football pretty shortly thereafter, and the main area that was effective for schools initially was the amount of access they had to postseason playing opportunities. Naturally, the bigger schools got to play in the big bowl games, the marquee matchups like the Rose and Orange Bowls, but some of the very top college division schools may be getting a crack at one of the lower level ones that the NCAA hadn't already shut down. All schools still officially existed under the same larger umbrella at this point, and for a time this arrangement worked. The smaller schools in this fashion still got access to the democratic power and decisions being made about the sport as a whole. But as the years marched on, the financial disparities only continued to grow, and the desire for bigger payouts on the university side followed suit.
First, there were concerns beginning around 1962 about the number of total bowl games diluting the product. This led to a further reduction in the quantity of postseason matchups and increased the already high potential payouts for those few blue blood programs that did manage to make those games. Then, in August of 1973, after a failed attempt that January, enough of the big schools finally banded together to create the first ever true division system in the NCAA, with a three-tiered D1, D2, and D3 system. As the big fish in the university division saw it, for years, the smaller schools had been able to control procedures within the organization by an almost 2-to-1 margin. Now, the 243 schools that had previously made up the university division, as well as the two new additions for that year, would comprise D1, with 200 mid-sized programs making up D2 and 225 smaller programs making up D3. This was enough to settle the internecine disputes for a couple years, but still, the upper echelon craved more separation from the smaller programs. In 1976, the first rumblings of shedding nearly another 100 schools from the top division of college football began to come to the surface of NCAA discussions. For 2 years, debates raged about the potential ramifications that would be faced, and frankly, if you paid any attention to the past few years here in the 2020s regarding conference realignment, there are some familiar refrains.
A super conference of elites has been formed by the haves of college football at the expense of the have-nots.
The bigs will rip down all the restraints on spending, open the lid on scholarship limits, coaching staffs, and recruiting costs.
Subdivision will be the death of 1AA schools. Reclassification will make them second-class citizens, and they will suffer accordingly in recruiting and support.
Some conferences will have to shut down because half their teams will go one way, half the other.
All of those quotes were pulled from a John Underwood article found in the Sports Illustrated issue from January 23, 1978 that came out just days after the decision passed to further break up Division I into Divisions 1A and 1AA. But while these lines might sound like legitimate concerns to you or me even now, Underwood was listing them off as straw men just to shut down each and every one of them. While he admits that this move is neither a massive elixir nor a massive knockout drop, Throughout the article, he expresses the utmost confidence that really this is in everyone's best interest, big and small schools alike. Furthermore, he put forward that this is really just a codification of obvious differences.
In truth, most teams that will make up Division I AA already have been grouped by sterner qualifiers than Roman numerals.
Either way, it didn't matter if assurances by Underwood and like-minded individuals were accurate. This was all a reaction to the decision already passing, after all. Eligibility requirements for 1A were formally set around the number of varsity sports, scheduling, stadium capacity, and attendance. Those that qualified for 1A would have to declare which of the two divisions they wanted to be in, and then set or maintain those benchmarks by the end of that period. Otherwise, they would join the remainder of schools already unable to qualify in the first place, comprising that new 1AA level.
It should be noted that even having the 1AA division was already a concession won by the smaller schools. Without it, and without further concessions that schools like the Ivy Leagues managed to negotiate, wherein having more than the baseline number of required sports could offset certain attendance benchmarks, nearly all the schools that failed to make 1A in football would have dropped all the way to D2 in all sports. After a chaotic 4 years with only 50 schools initially lining up to join the junior circuit by the January 1982 deadline, the NCAA reclassified dozens more in February and set the original membership numbers at 92 for 1A and 89 for 1AA. While individual schools would continue to be able to move up or down as the years went on, the two subdivisions had permanently split. So that's how the split happened. As for what the split means today, it still largely all comes down to financial resources. However, it's not just what the schools have at their disposal in terms of the money coming in. The 131 FBS schools are each allowed to have 85 total scholarships for players at any time. The 130 FCS schools, on the other hand, can only offer 63. They can split those scholarships amongst multiple players, but still, that's 22 fewer truly enticing roster spots. While one who supports this discrepancy would point to the resources needed to maintain a scouting and recruiting operation to be able to make intelligent roster decisions about 85 scholarship players and even more prospects, someone criticizing it would note that FCS schools will simply never have the kind of depth that their FBS counterparts have due to the difficulty that fewer scholarships to offer in the first place presents. In any case, this has led to a distinct gap in the talent of the subdivisions as a whole in the subsequent decades. So of course, you couldn't still have these two groups all participating in the same postseason anymore. As the names indicate, the football bowl subdivision teams got to keep the bowl games in the divorce, while the football championship subdivision was granted a new format for these schools altogether, a true playoff format for the championship. For the first season, just 4 teams were featured, the winners of the 3 regions in the East, West, and South, joined by 1 additional at-large selection.
And from the first season, the democratization that this kind of a postseason represented in contrast to the 1A subdivision was on full display. You had immediate proof positive that any team had a legitimate shot at a title in this format. Take, for instance, the Florida A&M University Rattlers. On November of 1978, 7-1 FAMU played 4-5 Southern University in their first ever in school history regionally televised game. FAMU coach Ron Hubbard was cited as saying that he believed his team at the time would have to win out just to have a chance at that one wildcard berth with the dominant Jackson State looking to be a lock to win the South. And Hubbard was correct. Jackson State took the South and hosted FAMU less than a month later, but Hubbard's Rattlers, after sneaking into the dance, managed to upset the Tigers 15-10 before then going on to beat the UMass Minutemen a week later to win the national championship. They had gone from their television debut to national champions in a single month. If these smaller schools had to settle for this lower level that they'd been relegated to, then at least this was the promise that it and its playoff format held. No longer would glory be limited to teams that could execute an entire season's worth of perfection. Here in 1AA, you can be flawed, you can be inconsistent, you can make mistakes. As long as you make it to the dance, you still have a chance to be a champion. That's the promise of the FCS, which is the new name that it now has entering the 2006 season. And coincidentally, this is the first season in which Joe Flacco is finally ready to take the field in Newark.
One note about Flacco's choice to join Delaware is that, in his own words, he, quote, wasn't sure he was making a choice. Because of Pitt's reticence to release him from his scholarship, he was limited in even being able to talk to other schools. He had a connection to Delaware going back to them recruiting him in high school because of Audubon High School's coach having played Delaware's coach, and this personal connection meant that once again, in Joe's own words, his decision was Delaware or nothing. Flacco arrived on campus with little fanfare the year prior for good reason. One last effect of Pitt's refusal to release him from his scholarship was that his first season with the Blue Hens would be spent on the sidelines. On those sidelines, he'd always be seen in khakis and a polo shirt, as NCAA rules forbade him from even wearing the uniform that season. And going into the year, the Blue Hens knew this would be the case, and they were fine with it. Senior Sonny Riccio would get a chance to finish out his Delaware career before ceding his spot to the young transfer. For his part, Flacco was happy just to practice as he integrated himself into the program and became a part of the team. The team took notice in those practices too. Offensive lineman Mike Byrne called him, quote, the best practice squad quarterback in the country and described him as dicing up the first-string defense. Wide receiver Swervin' Curvin' Michaud, then serving as team captain, described how years later he could still hear the whistle from the first ball he saw Flacco throw through the air. While he wouldn't be playing on Saturdays this year, at Flacco's first practice, Director of University of Delaware Football Operations Jerry Oravitz turned to the person next to him and said, this guy's going to be playing on Sundays. The game day Blue Hens finished with a respectable 6-5 in 2005 behind Riccio, but only went 3-5 in conference play, finishing far out of contention for the FCS playoffs, even with its now expanded field of 24 teams. But if these tales from the backfields were any indication, there was reason to hope that might be different soon. And so Joe and the team reached 2006. Now a full scholarship athlete, Flacco would no longer have to make do living behind the curtain in a shared apartment's dining room for $250 a month, while also having to pay out-of-state tuition. All he would have to worry about this season would be leading the team alongside now fifth-year head coach Casey Keeler.
Kurt Charles Keeler was himself a Blue Hen legend, having graduated in 1981 after playing as a linebacker for Coach Tubby Raymond, one of those architects of the wing T offense we mentioned before. In the 1978-1979 season, Keeler played for the Blue Hen squad that won the D2 championship in the school's final season before graduating to 1AA. Keeler got incredibly close to fulfilling his dream of playing for his boyhood team, the Philadelphia Eagles, go Birds, and almost got a USFL consolation prize with the Philadelphia Stars. But after being a late camp cut in 1982, 1983, and 1984, he decided it was time to turn to coaching. After the briefest of stints with the Amherst College Mammoths in Massachusetts, Keeler settled into a long posting at New Jersey's Rowan College with their D3 football team, the Professorial Owls, or Profs for short. Go Birds. Initially the wide receivers coach, Keeler was promoted to the head spot ahead of the 1993 season, just in time for him to lead the program to their first ever appearance in the D3 championship, otherwise known as the Amos Alonso Stag Bowl, named for that old University of Chicago coach. And then, they made it for the second time ever just 2 years later in 95, and again in 96, and 98, and 99. In just 7 years, Rowan reached 5 Stag Bowls after having never previously done so in school history, all coinciding with the elevation of Casey Keeler. Sure, they went 0-5 in those title matchups and lost by an average of about 34 points every time, but still.
So how did Keeler manage to take this school from Glassboro, New Jersey to the top of the D3 college football world? Well, in one word, recruiting, but in 2 words more specifically, bounce backs. Keeler's Rowan became one of the most welcome landing spots in the country for any player falling out of a Division I program after a couple disappointing years who was still looking for a chance to prove themselves again. In 1996, just a couple years into his tenure, he welcomed his largest transfer class yet, as 12 new former D1 players brought the total number of transfers from all levels of competition to a staggering 47 for that season. The championship may have eluded him, but winning certainly didn't. From 1993 to 2001, Keeler's Profs won 80% of their games and made the playoffs 7 times, including those 5 runs to the title game. And speaking of winning in 2001, one other notable win that occurred just a little further down I-95 that season, the 300th career win of Keeler's former coach and mentor, Tubby Raymond. With that capping his extensive career, Raymond retired at the end of the year, and after a long period of speculation of when Keeler would leave Rowan for greener pastures, we finally got the answer when he left after that 2001 season to take over as head coach of his alma mater, University of Delaware.
Keeler's success has only continued here at Delaware as he continued to prioritize not just recruiting, but recruiting players who find themselves in situations where playtime and roster spots are at a premium, and they're struggling to find the field. In 2003, just his second season, Keeler once again made a surprisingly quick trip to the championship with his new team, just as he had at Rowan in New Jersey. The only difference is that this time, Delaware won, beating Colgate 40-0 in the title game. Leading the Blue Hen defense was former 1AA Duke University linebacker Sean Johnson, squeezing out just one last year of eligibility. And leading the offense was a quarterback transfer from Division 1A Georgia Tech, Andy Hall. Even with this established success and with the expanded resources at his disposal, Keeler's recruiting would continue to always feature transfers heavily. Coach was happy to point out in 2004 that they led the country in out-of-state applications, beating out schools like Michigan and Texas. In his own words, that's what this school has become. Everybody wants to come to school here.
All of this is a lot less surprising to a modern-day fan who has seen transferring become increasingly commonplace thanks to advancements like the NCAA transfer portal in 2018 and massive overhauls that would prevent students from having to sit a year out as Joe did beginning in 2021. However, players coming in from other programs with almost zero collegiate experience and seizing the starting reins at the first opportunity didn't have a lot of precedent at the time. And for all transfers who come in to take a spot on the team, there's the other side of the equation, the incumbent player who must by definition be losing a spot. And so let us say a quick word for Ryan Carty.
The Flaccos and Maddens were far from the only dynastic New Jersey sports families. About an hour and a half up I-95 from Audubon, in the heretofore unmentioned far-off land of North Jersey, Somerville's first sports family was the Cardys. Growing up, his father, Kevin Sr., was the high school's title-winning coach, and Kevin was the third son to play under Papa Carty. There was any concern that the rest of his family would keep him in their shadows. Those had all been put to rest by the end of a senior season in which Carty, like Flacco, landed himself in the state record books with the single season high in touchdowns with 43. That performance landed him a chance with the Blue Hens thanks to his mobility, perfectly suited for Tubby Raymond's wing T offense. So it probably would have been better if Carty hadn't arrived at Newark the very first year after the retirement of Raymond, at the very same time that the aforementioned Coach Keeler arrived and began installing his new pro-style spread offense. We've already stated that this obviously worked out great for the Blue Hens. Just a year later, they're on top of the FCS world, and Carty is still there with them as a champion. But he is firmly entrenched as a championship caliber backup, the spot he will continue to hold all the way throughout that Sonny Riccio senior season in 2005. That's not to say that some of the Delaware faithful didn't disagree with Keeler's management of the quarterback room. As the 2005 season slogged on, fans often began "We want Carty" chants as the team continued to flounder with Riccio under center. Keeler remained loyal to his guy through the rest of 2005, but unfortunately for Carty, that loyalty would not extend to a guy who had been on campus long before Flacco's transfer. After all, you don't convince a guy like Joe Flacco to transfer unless there's going to be a chance for him to play. And when the main fan argument for starting Carty over Flacco boils down to our wide receiver core is too bad for us to use a passer as strong and talented as Flacco, then you might be propping up a losing argument. Ryan Carty never got a chance to be a starting quarterback in college. There are only so many opportunities in sports, and the dreams of one athlete will always need to come at the expense of another, particularly when we're dealing with the intricacies of the transfer system. We're clearly rooting for Joe, who is now on the precipice of finally getting to be a Division I quarterback. But it's worth mentioning Carty's magnanimity, if only to draw attention to everything that has needed to happen over the past few years to get to this point.
A senior year coaching change in high school for Flacco made his stars shine just bright enough to get a D1 scholarship, but not enough to ever actually see the field. But thankfully, a recently promoted D3 coach with a sterling resume, except for his chronic inability to win a title game, received a job from his alma mater. And then because of all that, and because he is powered almost entirely by overlooked cast-offs from other programs, and because now in 2006, the only person that could really challenge his anointed next man up for the starting spot was selected specifically for his fit in the predecessor's offensive system. We find ourselves at the beginning of a new era built up by a series of improbable coincidences that nonetheless have led us to the age of Delaware Blue Hens starting quarterback Joe Flacco. After a year on the sidelines, Joe finally lined up under center for the first time with Delaware on September 9th, 2006, and there, on Tubby Raymond Field at Delaware Stadium, he and the Blue Hens treated more than 22,000 fans to a 30-7 beatdown of non-conference rival Westchester's Golden Rams. Unfortunately, this was not the good omen that the Newark faithful might have thought it was. It's an up-and-down season in which they never win or lose more than 2 games in a row, and it'll ultimately end in disappointing fashion with a 5-6 record. Keeler's first losing record as a head coach at either of his 2 schools to date. Thankfully, for the purposes of our story, the blame was rarely laid at Joe's feet, or really at the feet of anyone on that side of the ball. Flacco was often trying to dig the offense out of early deficits throughout the season, and oftentimes he didn't even have the full complement of teammates available to him as he attempted to do so, with guys like wideout Swerve and Curve and Michaud being pressed into running back duty at times due to injuries. Even still, across his first 11 games as a starter since his senior year of high school, he managed to throw for 2,783 yards and 18 touchdowns, with another 5 touchdowns coming on the ground. At the very least, there was no question of whether or not he'd get another chance as a starter in 2007. It was just a question of what he was going to be able to do with that chance.
2007 marked the beginning of play in the Coastal Athletic Association Football Conference, formed by Delaware along with several other former A-10 members after the school's other sports had been competing under the CAA banner since the turn of the millennium. And to begin their play in the CAA, preseason number 19 Delaware traveled to Virginia to take on their longtime rivals at William & Mary. After the hosts chewed up more than half of the first quarter for a field goal, Flacco and senior running back Omar Cuff immediately marched down the field to go up 7-3, seizing the lead for good. Flacco would end up having a relatively modest day as Cuff was the star of the show, with 244 yards and 6 total touchdowns. But Flacco's 19 for 23 passing line for 201 yards showed at the very least the concerns that the receivers would not be able to catch his passes was a concern that fans could put out of their minds. With the final score of 49-31, the Delaware faithful could breathe easy, knowing that this team was going to put up points. They would improve to 2-0 the next week against Division II Westchester with 41 points and 599 total yards of offense. Even a mid-game injury to last week's Stars Cuff couldn't slow them down, as freshman Philip Thaxton set a program record for most yards in a debut. Flacco bumped his total up to 305 on the day and was described as untouchable in the pocket by the Cape Gazette's Dave Frederick. Returning to conference play, now ranked number 10, their domination continued unabated for the next 3 weeks over Rhode Island, Towson, and Monmouth by a combined score of 107-23. Flacco threw for 826 yards across those 3 wins, and alongside the aforementioned Cuff and team captain Swerve and Curve and Michaud, junior Aaron Love and sophomore Mark Duncan were emerging as Joe's best weapons in the receiving corps. Despite this, the team actually slid back in the rankings by a spot every week, from their peak number 10 against Rhode Island all the way to number 12 following their win against Monmouth. The next 2 weeks saw that offense post 30 points both times. They fell short on the road against number 15 New Hampshire in a 35-30 defeat, but they got the job done the next week for homecoming against Northeastern in a 30-20 win that got 6-1 Delaware back up to number 9 in the 1AA rankings, heading into a couple of highlight-laden weeks.
First up, we've got a trip to Annapolis to take on the D1A Navy Midshipmen at the Navy Marine Corps Stadium. Now, even at 4-3, the Midshipmen were the favorites to win in front of more than 35,000 because of that difference in division. But the crowd instead saw a career-best performance from Flacco, and considering the amount of running that usually typifies a Navy football game, the 41 pass attempts that Joe took must have made him look like an alien to them. 30 of those went for completions, totaling a career-high 434 yards of the team's 581 total on offense, and 4 of their 8 total touchdowns as they held on in the fourth quarter to shock the midshipmen with a 59-52 win, earning Flacco his first ever CAA Offensive Player of the Week honors. To put into perspective just how historic this offensive performance was in the grand scheme of Navy football, the last time 121 combined points had been scored in a game featuring the Navy football team was 1919. With just a couple crucial conference matchups to go, Flacco led the Blue Hens back to Newark the following week against the JMU Dukes, ranked number 12 at the time. He hucked the ball 41 times yet again with a little bit less success, only 23 completions for 257 yards, but managed to spread it around to 6 different receivers.
But I thought Delaware receivers couldn't handle his passes.
His arm was no good for scoring that day, but his feet carried him to one of the team's 4 rushing touchdowns as kicker John Streefsky's foot added the final crucial 9 points with 3 field goals to carry Delaware to a 5-0 home record, 6-1 in conference play, and 8-1 overall. Head coach Keeler could practically taste that postseason berth.
But then came November 10th, and into Newark came the number 9 ranked Richmond Spiders. In many ways, this game resembled many of Delaware's throughout the season. Omar Cuff led the way on the ground, and Flacco spread the ball to his 7 pass catchers altogether, but sent half of his completions towards Mark Duncan and Aaron Love for 226 of his 375 total passing yards. The thing that was unusual was that at halftime, the Blue Hens trailed, and as the clock ticked towards 0 in the fourth quarter, they were still trailing in the stadium where they had not yet lost all season. In part, they importantly trailed because of a Flacco mistake. Defensive back Seth Williams got the game's lone turnover when he snagged a pass intended for Aaron Love, just the 4th pick that Flacco had thrown all season, and returned it for a touchdown. The first time that an opponent had done so against the KC Keeler squad since 2005. Delaware got the ball back, trailing by 7, with 47 yards between them and the end zone and 45 seconds remaining. As my parents filed out, I pleaded out to them that with Joe Flacco at the helm, we still had a chance. And after making it to the goal line in 5 quick plays, with the clock ticking down, Flacco ran in for a goal line touchdown as the clock expired. Or had the clock expired? Even Flacco admitted later that he initially thought it had been too late, but the officials ruled it a touchdown. John Strajewski nailed the point after, and the game headed to overtime tied 38-38. The first overtime was a push with a pair of touchdowns, and the second a push with a pair of field goals. The teams were now approaching the league's all-time record in high-scoring games as they entered the third overtime tied 48-48. This time, Richmond came up short on a 4th-and-1 rushing attempt, but then with an attempt to win the game on the line, John Strajewski missed his only kick of the entire day to prolong the game into a 4th overtime. Next up, a pair of touchdowns and successful 2-point conversions from both teams' quarterbacks to make this a 56-56 game heading into overtime number 5. Richmond got the ball first this time and took the lead on a touchdown that marked the 10th time it had changed in that game. After a pair of Flacco passes were swatted down on 3rd and 4th down, it was over. Joe said that he'd never been involved in a game more fun than that when it was all said and done, but the loss was seismic for their playoff hopes. There was now no chance for a CAA title, meaning they would need to perform well enough in their final week against longtime rival Villanova to get an at-large bid for the postseason tournament. With a win, they'd certainly be in a good position, and with how Nova had played to that point, all they needed to do was not have their worst game of the season.
The next week, the Delaware Blue Hens managed to play their very worst game of the entire season. After a first quarter field goal and a short goal line touchdown pass from Flacco late in the second quarter, they simply refused to score for the rest of the game. And the worst part is, despite that 10-point total being their lowest on the season by 17, it was still almost enough. But after a completely blank third quarter, the previously shutout Nova scored on all 3 fourth quarter possessions with a rushing touchdown and 2 more field goals to win an embarrassing 16-10 game that easily could have been the end of Flacco's college career. Hell, if you ask some of the other schools in the top 25 of the Sports Network poll, they might say that it should have been the end of Flacco's career. After all, this was now an 8-3 team that had faltered mightily over its last 2 weeks to end up with that record. Meanwhile, there were schools with similar records trying to surge late in the season to get to that point, like 8-3 Eastern Illinois, or Elon and Cal Poly at 7-4, who were trying to crack those top 16 spots. But after the final poll came out, Delaware did manage to just hang on to the number 13 spot, and they began to prepare for their postseason journey.
Their first round opponent was a school both incredibly familiar to these students, but also a first-time foe on the gridiron. Back that same week when Delaware had lost the barn burner to Richmond, the area's local HBCU had won their first MEAC championship in 16 years and punched their first ever ticket to the NCAA playoffs. For the first time in history, Delaware and Delaware State would play each other in football, and it should be said that the reason that this has not occurred prior to this point is the Blue Hens have never been willing to schedule the Hornets. The Del State squad was plenty ready to use that chip on their shoulder as motivation to prove the doubters wrong, to show that them being the higher 10 seed to Delaware's 13 was no error.
Omar Cuff said, "Fuck that." After having spent the season conquering every possible career school record, most notably becoming the program's all-time scoring and rushing touchdowns leader, Cuff decided to add one more single-game record by piling an absurd 288 yards on 38 carries to go with 4 touchdowns as the Blue Hens won by a brutal 44-7 margin. The Hornets' offense didn't manage a single score, with their only touchdown coming off of a fumble return. For what it's worth, this game did also help Omar break the program's single-season rushing record, and a few other program high marks would be surpassed as their playoff run continued for at least one more week. Next up was a much more daunting task. A trip to face the Northern Iowa Panthers, the number 1 seeded 12-0 squad that had held the top spot in the Sports Network poll since mid-October. A pair of Delaware punts and UNI scores to start the game put the Hens in an early 10-0 hole. But Flacco took the field in the second quarter ready to respond and quickly tossed a pair of passing touchdowns. Then the Delaware defense showed up in the score sheet with a scoop and score fumble recovery to make it 19-10. Before a field goal by UNI cut the lead to 6 at half. UNI got the ball back at half and marched down the field to retake the lead 20-19. But a Delaware field goal on the next drive put them back up 22-20 and put them there for good, as Flacco and Cuff began to drain the clock like vampires while building the lead back out to 32-20 before the Panthers could even think about trying to manage a final comeback. In the eventual 39-27 win, Flacco finished with 312 passing yards, enough to pass Matt Nagy for the program record for most passing yards in the season. And with the win, they still had at least one more week to keep playing. It would be another road trip for the Blue Hens, as this time they traveled to take on the highest seed remaining, the number 4 ranked Southern Illinois Salukis. And it would be another quick 10-0 deficit in the first quarter for the Blue Hens. But they seem to be enjoying this whole come-from-behind setup.
Mark here for him. Good play action and wide open for the touchdown catch is Robbie Agnone. Pressure coming. Flacco throws it into the end zone. Touchdown. Delaware has its first lead. Mashad with the catch.
Those 10 would be the last 10 that the Southern Illinois Salukis would score until the fourth quarter, by which point Flacco had thrown a pair of touchdowns with no blocked extra points this time. In fact, Strajewski even added another 3 with his foot to go up 17-10 in the fourth quarter. After sending that one through the uprights, Strajewski booted the kickoff only to see the Salukis' Alan Turner take it all the way back to tie the game up at 17-all. Flacco, however, was up to the task as he marched 67 yards down the field and 5 passes to set up yet another Strajewski kick, which set the new single-season school record to retake the lead 20-17. The Salukis got 2 more chances, but a turnover on downs and an interception on those 2 drives kept the final score at 20-17. The Delaware Blue Hens would keep playing for one final week, and this time they were playing for a national championship.
They won the championship in 2003. Joe Flacco, the senior, didn't get an opportunity to play at Pittsburgh. Now he has an opportunity to win a national championship.
Coach Keeler was feeling pretty good about his team's chances after beating the number 1 and number 4 ranked teams on the road in consecutive weeks. But if anyone had any reservations about facing their opponent, Appalachian State, such concerns would be well-founded. The 2-time reigning 1AA champs were only ranked number 5 overall heading into this year's edition of the tournament, But this was also the App State team that famously beat the preseason number 5 ranked University of Michigan 34-32 in the first week of the season. And while they'd had narrow victories over James Madison and Eastern Washington in the first 2 rounds, they'd hung 55 on Richmond as they beat the Spiders by 20 to reach their 3rd straight title game.
Based on all accounts from the players and coaches heading into the game, they were unflappable. When yet another record fell as 23,010 fans filed in to Finley Stadium in Tennessee for the largest neutral site crowd in 1AA history, they were unfazed. Even when App State jumped to a 7-0 lead in the first, there were still probably plenty of folks in Delaware's corner that were still unbothered given the way the last 2 weeks had gone. And those same folks probably felt plenty vindicated as a pair of strikes from Flacco to Aaron Love got them in scoring position quickly.
In Southern Illinois, they trailed 10-0 before rallying to win. A blitz. Flacco hit as he throws, and it is caught! Caught by Aaron Love, just over the hands of the outstretched defender. Flacco started out at Pittsburgh, but then it looked like he was going to be a backup to Tyler Palco. He transferred to Delaware. He finds Love in the open field. First down inside the 10. He stumbles down.
But after they thought Omar Cuff tied it up, replay overturned the score, and they stalled out after failing to convert on 4th and inches. The Mountaineers immediately responded with a 99-yard touchdown drive, and after Strajewski missed a 35-yarder with a chance to make it 14-3, App State literally fumbled the ball into the end zone and still managed to score on the drive, going up 21-0. Even after Joe and the offense finally got things going with the Mark Duncan touchdown, App State ended the half with a 60-yard score to make it 28-7.
Maybe in a different story, the series of increasingly unlikely paths that led Flacco and his coach and his teammates and even the school to this point, maybe all those narrative threads binding together would be a compelling enough reason for the universe to cut them a break. Maybe it would be enough to make them believe that a comeback was going to happen. But sometimes a good story just isn't enough. The Mountaineers win by a final score of 49-21, completing their three-peat in Flacco's final college football game. There would be no storybook ending for the 2007 Blue Hens, but for Flacco, there were several chapters yet to come. Elite is a production of Remember That Guy. Written, researched, and recorded by James Lentzweiler, Justin Diaz, and Xavier Perez. All music is provided by RTG's musical director Don Ham, and sources for additional audio and all of our research can be found in the episode descriptions. More information on Elite and all things RTG related can be found at bit.ly/rememberthatguy, all one word, all lowercase. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider rating, reviewing, and sharing it. Word of mouth is our best and only sponsor. Until next time, thanks for listening.